The rain poured heavily on that October afternoon when Ava received the news that would change her life forever. At 15, she was used to the modest routine she shared with her mother, Susan. Though they had little, Susan was a pillar of love and protection for Ava, always teaching her that even in the darkest moments, there was a spark of hope. That's why when Ava saw two police officers standing at the door of their small house, she struggled to accept what she was about to hear. An accident. The officer's voice sounded distant, like an echo, as he explained the details. A runaway car had collided with Susan's vehicle on a sharp curve. There was no time for help. Ava's world collapsed in silence. She didn't cry right away. She didn't scream. She just stood there, clutching the hem of the sweater her mother had knitted, as if that could keep reality at bay. The days that followed were a blur. With no close relatives and no financial plan left behind by her mother, Ava was placed in the foster care system. The orphanage where she was sent revealed a cruel side of life. The halls were cold, the walls painted a faded beige, and the voices of the other children ranged from loud laughter to murmurs that only made the place more unsettling. Yet Ava found a way to isolate herself. Whenever she could, she would sit in the small, dimly lit library, flipping through old books that no one else cared about. Reading became her escape, a place where the world seemed less hostile. But the orphanage wasn't all silence. There were strict rules and frequent punishments for those who didn't follow them. Determined to stay invisible, Ava did her best to avoid trouble. Some children were cruel, while others were merely surviving. One girl in particular, Joanna, seemed to enjoy hiding Ava's few belongings or mocking the simplicity of her clothes. Ava never fought back. She knew the world wasn't kind and that fighting wouldn't change anything. The years dragged on. Ava finished high school, standing out as a dedicated student, but without forming any close friendships or connections. When she turned 18, she was told she would have to leave the orphanage. There would no longer be a roof over her head, however humble, or guaranteed meals. With a small suitcase and an envelope containing basic documents, she found herself alone in a big city. The first year outside the orphanage was brutal. With no support, Ava rented a tiny room in a rundown neighborhood, using the little money she earned from temporary jobs. She worked as a clerk in a home goods store, spending long hours on her feet, dealing with customers who often treated her as invisible. Even so, Ava didn't complain. Her goal was simple: to survive. But life seemed determined to test her again. An economic downturn caused the store where she worked to close, leaving her unemployed. That's when a problem she had been ignoring for years began to worsen. Ava had a hearing issue in her right ear since childhood, a condition that grew worse under stress. The constant dizziness and pain made her even more vulnerable. With no money for treatment, she just gritted her teeth and kept going. One night, sitting on a park bench, Ava watched the city lights. She had nowhere to go, and the thought of facing yet another aimless day made her chest tighten. That's when she noticed a piece of newspaper caught in the leaves of a bush. She picked it up, more out of distraction than hope, and started flipping through it. Among ads for sales and services, one headline caught her eye. Housekeeper wanted, immediate start. The promise of housing and meals included seemed like the answer to her problems, even if only temporarily. Ava stood up from the bench, clutching the piece of newspaper tightly. That night, for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. What she didn't know yet was that this ad would mark the beginning of a path filled with pain, revelations, and transformation. A path that would lead her back to a past she barely knew and a future she never imagined possible. The next morning, Ava woke up early, determined to seize this opportunity. The job ad in the newspaper felt like her last chance to climb out of the abyss her life had fallen into. With the crumpled newspaper in hand, she took 2 buses to reach the address listed, a part of the city she had never visited before. Stepping off the bus, she immediately noticed the difference. The streets were wide and tree-lined, and the houses had high walls with automatic gates. They belonged to a world completely different from hers. When she arrived at the house described in the ad, Ava hesitated. It was an imposing mansion with wrought-iron gates and perfectly manicured gardens. She felt small in front of such grandeur. Summoning her courage, she rang the doorbell. A few seconds later, a tired-looking woman appeared. This was Faith, the housekeeper, whose assessing gaze lingered on Ava for a moment before opening the gate. "Are you the girl who saw the ad?" Faith asked, frowning slightly at Ava's modest appearance. Ava nodded and immediately handed over her documents, explaining her situation. Faith seemed hesitant, but was moved by the vulnerability in the young woman's eyes. "Come on, I'll introduce you to the lady of the house," she said, gesturing for Ava to follow. Ava entered, awestruck by the grandeur of the place. The marble floors gleamed, the chandeliers sparkled, and the air smelled of fresh flowers. Yet there was a coldness to the space, as if the outward beauty concealed an invisible hardness. In the living room, Charlotte, the lady of the house, was waiting. She was a woman with refined features and a rigid posture, her eyes always seeming to evaluate what was useful or disposable. When Faith introduced Ava, Charlotte gave a forced smile, a gesture that felt more like a formality than genuine kindness. "She looks too young for the job, but we can give her a chance," Charlotte declared, her tone laced with disdain. "Faith, explain the rules. I want everything crystal clear from the start." Faith nodded, casting a discreetly sympathetic glance at Ava, and began listing the conditions. Ava would have a small room at the back of the house, converted from an old cleaning closet, since the maid's quarters were now reserved exclusively for Harper's cat, the daughter's pet. Moreover, there would be no regular days off, and Ava would need to be available for any task at any time. Though the rules were harsh, Ava accepted without hesitation. She knew she was in no position to refuse. Her new room was tiny and stuffy, with a narrow bed and a window so small it barely let in any light. But for Ava, it was more than she'd had in recent days. That first night was tough. The mattress was uncomfortable, and the house's noises, footsteps upstairs, the distant hum of the television, seemed amplified in the silence. The next morning, the work began early. Ava had to clean the kitchen, tidy the bedrooms, and organize the family's laundry. Harper, Charlotte's daughter, appeared for the first time while Ava was cleaning the living room. Harper was the same age as Ava, but didn't seem to see her as an equal. She wore expensive clothes, moved with an air of superiority, and directed her first cruel remark without hesitation. "I hope you know how to clean properly. If you break anything, they'll dock your pay," Harper said before leaving the room with a mocking laugh. Ava swallowed the humiliation, reminding herself how much she needed this job. The following days were filled with exhausting tasks and uncomfortable interactions. Charlotte was demanding and rarely showed any satisfaction. Harper seemed to take pleasure in making Ava's work harder, deliberately spilling drinks on freshly cleaned floors or complaining about imaginary dirt. Faith was the only person who showed Ava any compassion. Though strict, the housekeeper sometimes offered encouraging words or quietly helped Ava during particularly tough moments. But even Faith seemed resigned to the oppressive dynamics of the house. One particularly difficult night, Ava sat in her tiny room holding the framed photo of her mother, the only one she had. The exhaustion and physical pain felt almost unbearable, but Ava made a promise to herself. She would find a way out of this situation. At that moment, however, she had no idea that her presence in this house was about to set off a chain of events that would change her life forever. Early that morning, John came downstairs for breakfast before heading to work. A middle-aged man with a firm posture, his face always carried a hint of melancholy. The successful doctor spent most of his time away from home, dedicating himself to his patients, while secretly avoiding the stifling atmosphere of his own household. His wife, Charlotte, ruled the house with an iron fist, while his daughter, Harper, seemed to be growing into a distorted reflection of her mother. As he walked down the hallway toward the dining room, John heard a noise coming from the service area. It was unusual to hear activity there so early. Approaching the source, he saw Ava on her knees, scrubbing a stubborn stain on the tile floor. Something about the way she moved, determined and silent, caught his attention. "Is everything all right?" he asked, breaking the silence. Ava looked up, startled. John rarely spoke to the household staff, a formality Charlotte made sure to enforce. Ava hesitated before answering, unsure of how to proceed. "Yes, sir, just cleaning," she said, quickly returning to scrubbing the floor. "You're limping," he observed, noticing the slight imbalance in her steps as she shifted positions. "What happened?" Ava tried to hide her discomfort, but the pain from her injured ankle was evident. "It's nothing serious. "Just an accident," she replied softly. John frowned but didn't press further. Instead, he lingered for a moment, watching her. There was something about her that intrigued him, a familiar feeling he couldn't quite place. He decided to leave without saying anything else, but the brief interaction lingered in his mind throughout the day. Meanwhile, Ava continued her routine. Despite her swollen ankle, she didn't dare ask for a day off. Charlotte was particularly demanding that day, instructing Ava to reorganize the kitchen cabinets while criticizing every detail. "That plate doesn't belong there. Is it really so hard to follow instructions?" Charlotte said, her sharp eyes scanning Ava's work. The tension in the house was suffocating. As usual, Harper made a point of interrupting Ava whenever she could, giving contradictory orders just to test her patience. But Ava, as always, endured everything in silence. That evening, when Ava finally retreated to her small room, she felt utterly drained. Sitting on the thin mattress, she held the photo of her mother. A daily ritual, a moment of connection with the woman who had been her only family. But that night, she noticed something was off. A small picture frame that usually sat on her makeshift shelf was tilted. Ava straightened the frame and realized it had been flipped over. Inside was an old photo of her mother, Susan, young and smiling on a sunny day. Beside her was a man whose face seemed vaguely familiar. Her mother had never spoken much about him, always saying Ava's father had died when she was very young. Upstairs, John was also unable to sleep. Something about the young housekeeper's expression continued to unsettle him. He decided to go downstairs for a glass of water, and as he passed the hallway near Ava's tiny room, noticed her door slightly ajar. It wasn't his intention to intrude, but something caught his eye, the photo in Ava's hands. He stopped, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the image. It was Susan. John felt a chill run through him. The young woman looked far too much like Susan for it to be a coincidence. He stood frozen in the hallway as long-buried memories began to resurface. He remembered the relationship he had with Susan in his youth, a romance he had abandoned out of immaturity and ambition. He remembered her smile, her laughter, and the way she looked at him with a trust he didn't deserve. That same night, John quietly entered his study and searched through old files until he found a box of keepsakes he had held onto without really knowing why. Inside was a photo of Susan, young and full of life. He compared the two images, the one he had and the one he had seen in Ava's hands. The resemblance was undeniable. John felt a storm of emotions, guilt, disbelief, and an overwhelming need for answers. He needed to confirm his suspicions, but more than that, he needed to understand how his life had veered so far from that moment in his youth. That night, he resolved to confront Ava the next day. She deserved answers, and perhaps so did he. The next morning, John woke up earlier than usual. He went through breakfast distractedly, barely responding to Charlotte's trivial questions about his schedule for the day. His mind was fixed on the conversation he planned to have with Ava. While Charlotte and Harper discussed mundane topics in the living room, he quietly made his way to the service area. Ava was in the kitchen, cleaning silverware. Her face showed signs of exhaustion, but she worked meticulously, as always. John paused at the doorway, observing her for a moment before speaking. "Ava," he said, his tone gentler than she expected. She turned quickly, surprised. It was rare for John to address her directly, and there was something in his expression that unsettled her. "Yes, sir," she replied, drying her hands with a dish towel. "Can we talk?" he asked, gesturing toward a small table near the window. Ava hesitated but nodded. She sat down, trying to hide her apprehension. John remained standing for a moment, as if organizing his thoughts, before taking the seat across from her. "Last night I saw a photo in your room," he began carefully. "It was a picture of your mother, wasn't it?" Ava frowned, surprised by the question. "Yes, it was my mother." "Why?" she responded, unsure where this was going. John took a deep breath before continuing. "What was her name?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Susan," Ava answered, her voice tinged with sadness. "My mother's name was Susan. She passed away when I was 15. Her words hit him like a blow. John felt a tightness in his chest, as if the air around him had disappeared. He lowered his gaze for a moment, trying to process it all. "Susan," he murmured almost to himself. I knew her many years ago. Ava sat frozen, her heart racing. She didn't know how to respond. Why was he talking about her mother? You knew her? She asked, trying to make sense of the situation. Yes, we had a relationship when we were young. I loved her, but I was immature. I ended up taking a different path, leaving it all behind. John paused, visibly shaken. Ava, I need to ask you something. Do you know who your father is? The question hit like a shockwave. Ava stayed silent for a few seconds, the weight of her mother's memory pressing on her. My mom always told me my father died when I was very young, she said, her voice thick with emotion. She never talked much about him. John closed his eyes briefly, trying to steady the flood of emotions. Now he knew. There was no doubt. Ava was his daughter. Ava, I believe I'm your father, he said, his voice breaking. The words hung in the air like a bombshell. Ava blinked, unable to process what she had just heard. What? She whispered, her voice barely audible. The resemblance, the photo, and the timing, John continued. It all adds up. I didn't know Susan was pregnant when we separated. If I had known, I never would have abandoned you. Ava felt the world around her spinning. His words didn't make sense, but at the same time, there was something in his sincerity that was undeniable. She wanted to deny it, to believe he was mistaken, but the pieces were falling into place. The absence of a father, her mother's silence on the subject, it all pointed to this. You're saying you're my father? She asked, still in shock. John only nodded, the pain and regret etched on his face. I don't want to scare you or pressure you, he said, his voice trembling. But I need to make this right. I want to be here for you if you'll let me. Ava recoiled, standing up from the table. She felt suffocated, as if the air had been sucked out of the room. It was all too much to process. I need some time, she said, her voice unsteady. This is too much. I don't know what to think. John nodded, respecting her need for space. That's okay. Take all the time you need, but please know I'm here, Ava. I'll always be here for you. Ava quickly left the kitchen, her heart heavy. She went upstairs to her room and shut the door, trying to sort through her thoughts. It was hard to accept that life, which had already been so cruel to her, was now throwing this unexpected twist her way. As much as she wanted to believe him, a part of her was afraid to open herself up to something that seemed too good to be true. Meanwhile, downstairs, John remained seated at the table, lost in thought. He knew he would have to face Charlotte and Harper soon, but at that moment all that mattered was Ava. He was determined to make up for the lost time, no matter what it took. The tension in the house was palpable the next morning. Ava avoided making eye contact with John, while he, in turn, was visibly restless. Charlotte, always perceptive, noticed her husband's strange behavior and eyed him suspiciously over breakfast. Is something wrong, John? She asked, her tone sharp as she stirred her tea. Nothing that concerns you right now, Charlotte, he replied curtly. The brief exchange didn't escape Harper's notice. She thrived on any opportunity to stir up drama. Ava, who had entered the room to clear the breakfast dishes, felt the weight of Charlotte and Harper's stares, as if she were an intruder daring to share their air. You seem clumsier than usual today, Harper remarked with a cynical smile. Did you sleep in your little moldy closet, or did you decide to clean the floor with your face? Ava didn't respond. She picked up the dishes and left without looking back, which only made Harper laugh harder. John, however, watched the scene silently, a look of disapproval becoming harder for him to conceal. That afternoon, Ava tried to focus on her chores, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the conversation from the previous night. The idea that John might be her father was hard to accept, but something inside her whispered that he was telling the truth. Even so, the uncertainty gnawed at her. She needed proof, something to confirm or deny his claims. As Ava wrestled with her thoughts, John was determined to act. He knew he couldn't leave things as they were. That evening, he resolved to confront Charlotte and Harper. He had to put an end to the humiliation Ava was enduring and protect her, even if it meant revealing a truth that would upend their family dynamic forever. When evening fell, John called Charlotte and Harper into the dining room. It was rare for him to take such an authoritative stance at home, and it immediately caught their attention. "What's going on, John?" Charlotte asked, crossing her arms. "I'm busy, you know." Harper, standing beside her mother, looked at him with an expression of boredom. "We need to talk," John said firmly. "About Ava." Ava's name was enough to make Charlotte narrow her eyes. "What about her?" Charlotte replied, her voice dripping with disdain. "If she's done something wrong, just fire her. It's about time anyway." John took a deep breath, trying to keep his rising anger in check. "You two," he began, pointing at Charlotte and Harper, "have been treating Ava as if she's less than human. That stops now." Harper let out a disbelieving laugh. "Are you serious? She's just the maid. You've never cared about the staff before. What's with the sudden concern?" "Because Ava isn't just the maid," John said, his voice rising. "She's my daughter." The silence that followed was almost suffocating. Charlotte turned pale, her expression frozen in a mix of shock and disbelief. Harper, on the other hand, looked like she thought this was some sort of joke. "You're what?" Charlotte finally managed to say, her voice low and dangerous. "My daughter," John repeated, meeting Charlotte's gaze directly. "Before I met you, I had a relationship with Susan, Ava's mother. I didn't know she was pregnant when we parted ways. I just found out, and I won't allow you to keep treating my daughter like this." Charlotte stood abruptly, slamming her hands on the table. "This is ridiculous, John. Are you seriously saying that girl, that intruder, is your daughter? This has to be some kind of sick joke." John remained calm, though his patience was wearing thin. "It's not a joke, Charlotte, and from now on, things are going to change in this house." Harper, who had been silent until now, exploded. "This is insane. She can't be your daughter. She's lying to get something out of you." "Enough, Harper," John shouted, his composure finally slipping. "Ava is my daughter, and you will respect her. If you can't, you'll have to deal with the consequences." Charlotte was still reeling, but her shock quickly morphed into controlled fury. "You think you can walk in here and lay down the law, John?" she said, her eyes narrowing. "If you want to play daddy to that girl, go ahead. But don't expect me or Harper to accept this. We're under no obligation to tolerate it." John stood facing Charlotte with a resolve she had never seen in him before. "You're right. You don't have to accept it. But from now on, Ava will have a place in this house, a place of dignity, or we'll all have to face the consequences together. And Charlotte, if you keep behaving this way, maybe it's time we reconsider our relationship." His words struck like a direct blow, leaving Charlotte speechless. Harper stormed out of the room, her footsteps heavy with anger. John knew this was only the beginning of the conflict, but he felt a sense of relief in finally speaking the truth. Deep down, he understood that more resistance lay ahead, but he was ready to fight to protect Ava and make up for the years he had lost. The silence in the house was heavy after the confrontation the night before. Charlotte had locked herself in the bedroom, furious, while Harper spent the day glued to her phone, likely venting her anger on social media. Ava, unaware of what had happened, continued her routine, though she noticed an even heavier atmosphere than usual. John knew he couldn't delay any longer. He needed to talk to Ava again, this time with more composure. He climbed the stairs to her cramped little room and knocked softly on the door. "Ava, can we talk?" he called. On the other side, Ava hesitated before answering. Since John's revelation, she had been avoiding any interaction that might deepen the subject, but she knew he wouldn't give up. "Come in," she said quietly. John opened the door and stopped, seeing her sitting on the small mattress, once again holding the photo of her mother. He couldn't help but notice how unworthy the space was, cramped, cold, and unwelcoming. It only strengthened his resolve to change her life. "I know it's a lot to process, but I need you to know that everything I said is true." He began, sitting on a nearby stool. "I am your father, Ava, and while I can't change the past, I want to be part of your future." Ava looked at him, searching for any sign of deceit or manipulation in his words. All she saw was sincerity and the weight of genuine regret. "Why now?" she asked. "Why say this now after so long?" "Because I didn't know," John replied, his voice heavy with guilt. "Susan never told me she was pregnant. If I'd known, I would never have left you two. I made mistakes, Ava, many, but I won't make the mistake of ignoring you now." Ava remained silent, absorbing his words. She wanted to believe him, but life had taught her to be cautious. "Do you really think you can fix all of this?" she asked, her voice tinged with pain. "I spent years alone, facing things you can't even imagine. Now you show up and want to be part of my life, as if it's that simple." "I know it's not simple," John admitted. "And I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I just want you to know that I'm here. I want to help you, however I can." Ava lowered her gaze. Part of her wanted to push him away, to protect herself from more disappointment. But another part, one she rarely let surface, yearned for this connection, for a chance to finally have someone who cared. "I need time," she said at last. "I don't know if I can trust this, but I won't reject what you're offering." John nodded, accepting her words. He knew the road ahead would be long, but he was willing to walk it. "Time is something we have, Ava. I just want you to know that from now on you're not alone." Before he could say more, hurried footsteps echoed down the hallway. The door to the small room burst open, revealing Harper, who had clearly been eavesdropping on their conversation. "Are you serious?" Harper yelled, pointing at John. "You're really going to treat this girl like she's part of our family?" Ava stood up, startled by the sudden intrusion. Harper glared at her as if she were the source of all her problems. "Harper, this doesn't concern you right now," John said, trying to stay calm. "Doesn't concern me," Harper shot back, crossing her arms. "Of course it does. You're destroying our family because of her. And for what? Because you suddenly decided to play the good guy?" "Harper, enough," John said, his voice firm. "Ava is your sister. You may not like it, but it's the truth. And if you want to stay in this house, you will respect her." Harper let out an incredulous laugh. "Sister? Don't make me laugh. She's just an opportunist, always has been. I bet she's loving all this attention, isn't she?" Harper said, directing her venom toward Ava. Ava stayed still, trying to hold back the tears threatening to fall. Before she could respond, John stood up, his presence commanding, and looked directly at Harper with an intensity that made her take a step back. "Harper, if you think you can keep acting this way, you're very mistaken," he said. "It's time you learn that the world doesn't revolve around you. And if you can't respect Ava, maybe you should start thinking about what your life will look like outside this house." Harper was speechless for a moment, but quickly turned and stormed out, stomping up the stairs and shouting something unintelligible. John turned back to Ava, who still seemed shaken. "I won't let anyone treat you like that again," he said firmly. "I promise." Ava nodded, trying to steady herself. For the first time in a long while, she felt like someone was on her side, but she still wasn't sure if she could allow herself to believe it fully. As John left the room, Ava was left alone again, trying to make sense of everything that was happening. Her life, already so unpredictable, now seemed completely upended, but despite all the chaos, a small spark of hope was beginning to flicker. The next day began with an even more palpable tension in the house. Charlotte barely made it to breakfast before making her dissatisfaction evident. John, however, remained calm. He knew that further confrontations with his wife and daughter were inevitable, but he had no intention of backing down. While Charlotte busied herself giving orders to the household staff, John decided to take a more concrete step to improve Ava's life. He called her into his study, a room where few were ever invited. Ava, still wary, entered the space lined with books and documents, noting the immaculate organization that seemed to mirror John's personality. "Have a seat, please," he said, gesturing to a chair. She complied, trying to mask her unease. John opened a drawer and pulled out an envelope. He placed it on the desk and slid it toward her. "I want you to see this as the first step in making things right," he began. "This is the money you'll need to treat your hearing issue and get any tests done. It's the least I can do." Ava stared at the envelope, hesitant. She had never received anything without working tirelessly for it. "I'm not sure I can accept this," she said, lowering her gaze. "This isn't about accepting or not, Ava," John replied, his tone firm yet gentle. "This is something you need, and I want you to know that no matter what, I'm here to take care of you." She picked up the envelope with trembling hands, feeling a mix of gratitude and discomfort. She was used to fighting her battles alone, and accepting help was unfamiliar and unsettling. "Thank you," she whispered, barely audible. I'll arrange an appointment with a specialist for you, John continued. We'll get this resolved as quickly as possible, and after that I want you to think about going back to school. You deserve the chance to build the life you've always deserved. Before the conversation could go further, the office door was abruptly thrown open. Charlotte entered, her face red with anger. What exactly is going on here? She demanded, looking from John to Ava. John stood, keeping his composure. I'm doing what I should have done a long time ago, Charlotte. I'm helping my daughter. Your daughter? Charlotte repeated with disdain. That doesn't make her part of this family. You're acting like she's the priority now, while forgetting who really matters. John stared at her, his patience nearing its limit. Who really matters? He asked, his voice steady. Charlotte, you've spent years controlling this house, ignoring others, and treating people like disposable pieces. It's time for that to change. Charlotte crossed her arms, her glare burning with rage. If you think I'm going to stand by while you destroy everything we've built, you're mistaken. This house is mine, and you're not going to turn it into a shelter for strangers. Strangers? John repeated, his voice rising. Ava is not a stranger. She's my daughter, Charlotte. And I won't allow you or Harper to treat her like trash. Charlotte let out a sarcastic laugh. Fine, John. If you want to play the hero, go ahead. But I'm not participating in this farce. And if you insist on this, maybe it's time we start discussing what will happen to us. Maybe we should, John replied without hesitation. Because honestly, Charlotte, I'm tired. Tired of living with someone who only cares about themselves. Those words caught Charlotte off guard. For the first time, she seemed to realize John was serious and willing to see this through. Let's see how far this goes, John, she said, before storming out, slamming the door behind her. Ava, who had been watching the scene in silence, felt confused and uneasy. She didn't want to be the cause of more conflict, but at the same time she couldn't ignore what was happening. I'm sorry, she said, standing up. I didn't mean to cause trouble. This isn't your fault, Ava, John replied gently. These tensions have been here for a long time. You just brought them to the surface, and honestly, that might be for the best. She nodded, but still felt a pang of guilt. John noticed her hesitation and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. We'll get through this together, he said. I promise. Ava left the study shortly after, feeling torn between relief and the weight of the situation. Upstairs, Charlotte locked herself in the bedroom, already planning her next move. Meanwhile, Harper, who had been eavesdropping from her room, began to realize her life was about to change, and she didn't like it one bit. John, for his part, knew the battle was just beginning, but for the first time in years he felt he was on the right path. He was determined to rebuild his relationship with Ava, no matter the consequences. The morning began with an eerie silence in the house. Charlotte had spent the night locked in her bedroom, refusing to speak to John or even Harper. As usual, Ava started her tasks early, but this time she felt a different kind of tension in the air. It wasn't the familiar discomfort. This felt like something was about to erupt. John, on the other hand, was determined to move forward with his plans. He had scheduled Ava's doctor's appointment for that afternoon and was ready to make it clear to everyone in the house that she would no longer be subjected to humiliation. He knew, however, that every step would be a challenge. Charlotte wasn't the kind of woman to accept change without a fight, and Harper had inherited her stubbornness. Shortly after breakfast, Harper decided to make her move. She found Ava in the kitchen, scrubbing the sink, and walked in with deliberate steps, a venomous smile on her face. So the new princess of the house is getting VIP treatment now, huh? Harper said, leaning against the counter. Daddy's taking you to the doctor. Maybe he'll buy you a castle next. Ava took a deep breath, trying not to react. She knew Harper was trying to provoke her. I'm only going to the doctor because it's something I need, Ava replied, keeping her tone neutral. Oh, of course, Harper said with a laugh. The poor little helpless girl who's now Daddy's favorite. You must be loving this, aren't you? Finally getting what you wanted. I never asked for any of this, Ava said, trying to stay calm. I just want to live my life in peace. Peace? Harper raised an eyebrow. You've destroyed our family. My dad never had the guts to stand up to my mom before you showed up. This is all your fault. Ava stopped what she was doing and looked directly at Harper. For the first time, she let her emotional exhaustion show. "I didn't choose any of this, Harper. Do you think this is easy for me? I've spent my entire life alone with no one. All I want is a little dignity, and if that bothers you, that's your problem, not mine." Harper was momentarily stunned by Ava's firmness, but before she could respond, John walked into the kitchen. He immediately picked up on the tension and crossed his arms. "Harper, that's enough," he said in a stern tone. "Leave Ava alone." Harper looked at him, incredulous. "It's always her, isn't it?" Harper shouted. "Everything is about her now. You don't even care about me or Mom anymore. It's like we don't exist." "You and your mother have always had everything," John replied, stepping closer. "Always. But that doesn't mean I can ignore my responsibilities to Ava. She's my daughter too, Harper, and you need to accept that." "I'll never accept it," Harper screamed, storming out of the kitchen and stomping up the stairs. John sighed, rubbing his face with his hands. He looked more tired than ever, but his focus didn't waver. He turned to Ava, who was now visibly uncomfortable. "Don't let her intimidate you," he said gently. "She's going to need time to process this, but you're not alone. Are you ready to go to the doctor?" Ava nodded, grabbing the jacket she had left on a nearby chair. As they left the house, she felt a mix of relief and anxiety. For the first time in years, someone was trying to take care of her, but the cost seemed unbearably high. At the doctor's office, John stayed by Ava's side throughout the appointment. The doctor, after examining her and listening to her complaints, confirmed that she had a chronic issue with her inner ear, which was causing the dizziness and pain. The good news was that the treatment would be effective and significantly improve her quality of life. "This is just the beginning," John said as they left the office. "We'll take care of your health first. Then I want you to think about going back to school. I want to see you thrive, Ava." She couldn't respond immediately. His words were comforting, but they also carried a weight she didn't know how to handle. Accepting help was hard enough, but accepting that someone genuinely cared for her was entirely foreign. When they returned home, the tension was even thicker. Charlotte was in the living room, arms crossed, clearly waiting for John. The moment he walked in, she started. "So this is what we've come to. You're spending the family's money on this girl now?" Charlotte snapped. John looked at her, exhausted but resolute. "I'm spending money on my daughter, Charlotte. If that bothers you so much, maybe we should really consider whether this house is big enough for the two of us." His words struck like a direct blow, and Charlotte was momentarily speechless. Ava, who had paused in the hallway, heard everything in silence. She felt guilty as if she were the catalyst for all this destruction. But she also realized something deeper was at play. This family dynamic had been fractured long before she arrived. She climbed to her small room and closed the door, trying to shut out the chaos. That night, as she stared at the photo of her mother again, she wondered if she had finally found a place where she could belong. But she knew that, before anything else, she would need to learn how to trust. Meanwhile, downstairs, John remained in the living room, facing Charlotte with a determination she had never seen before. The final confrontation felt inevitable, and both of them knew that the future of this household would never be the same. The house was steeped in silence that morning, but it wasn't a peaceful kind of silence. It was tense, laden with resentment and mistrust. Ava woke up early as usual and began organizing her things. Despite John making it clear that she was part of the family, she still felt like her presence in the house was a source of discord that she couldn't ignore. Downstairs, Charlotte sat in the living room with a distant look on her face. Harper sat beside her, scrolling furiously through her phone, her expression shifting between irritation and disdain. John entered the room, holding a folder in his hand, determined to address the unresolved issues once and for all. "We need to talk," he said, looking directly at Charlotte. "Oh, now you want to talk?" she retorted with sarcasm. "After weeks of ignoring our family to focus on your new daughter." "This isn't a competition, Charlotte," John replied firmly. "What's happening here is bigger than you or me. And honestly, if you can't understand that, maybe it's time we went our separate ways." Charlotte's eyes widened, stunned by his bluntness. Harper, sensing the gravity of the conversation, finally looked up from her phone. "Are you threatening me with divorce?" Charlotte asked, incredulous. "It's not a threat," John said. "It's a possibility I'm considering because I'm tired of living with someone who only knows how to impose their ego. Ava is my daughter, and I won't abandon her because of your pride." Harper stood up, furious. "This is ridiculous. You're going to throw our family away for her. She shouldn't even be here," she shouted, pointing toward the ceiling where Ava's small room was. John took a deep breath, trying to rein in his anger. This family was broken long before Ava came, Harper, and that's not her fault. If you can't accept the truth, that's your problem, not hers. Charlotte rose to her feet, crossing her arms. "Fine, John, you want Ava here? Great. But just know that if you keep this obsession up, you'll end up alone. Because Harper and I won't tolerate this." John held her gaze, his expression unwavering. "Maybe I'd rather be alone than continue living with this kind of toxicity," he said. "But let me be clear, Charlotte, this is your choice. I'm not forcing you to leave. If you want things to work, you need to change. You need to learn to be better, for yourself and for Harper." Charlotte opened her mouth to respond, but was interrupted by the sound of soft footsteps in the hallway. Ava stood there, holding a small travel bag. She had overheard part of the conversation and felt guilty for being at the center of the conflict. "I'm leaving," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "I don't want to cause any more problems." John turned to her quickly, alarmed. "No, Ava, you're not leaving," he said, stepping toward her. "This isn't your fault. It's not fair for you to pay the price for what's happening here." "But she started, but he cut her off. "No. I've already lost too many years with you, and I'm not losing any more. You deserve a place here. You deserve respect, and I won't let them push you out of my life." Ava looked at him, her eyes brimming with tears. She wanted to believe him, but the guilt still weighed heavily on her. "I just want peace," she said, her voice trembling. "And you'll have it," John promised. "But to get there, we need to face this together." Charlotte, watching the scene, realized something she'd never admit aloud. John was more determined than she'd ever seen him. For the first time, she felt like she was losing control. "Do whatever you want, John," she said coldly, "but don't expect me to be a part of it." She walked out of the room, leaving John and Ava alone. Harper hesitated for a moment, but quickly followed her mother, stomping her feet in frustration. John turned to Ava and placed his hands on her shoulders. "You're not alone anymore, Ava. Not anymore. And I'll do whatever it takes to make sure you get what you deserve." She nodded, though tears still streamed down her face. For the first time, she felt like someone was truly fighting for her. Yet she knew the road ahead would be anything but easy. Upstairs, Charlotte and Harper each retreated to their rooms, processing what had just happened. Charlotte stared out the window, her face a mixture of anger and confusion. Harper, on the other hand, felt something she rarely experienced: insecurity. For the first time, she wondered if she was wrong. That night, the house was quieter than ever. In her small room, Ava stared at the photo of her mother and whispered to herself, "I hope I'm doing the right thing." In his study, John closed his eyes and vowed that he wouldn't let Ava down again. No matter what challenges lay ahead, he was ready. The next morning brought a sense of change to the house. Though the tension lingered, something had shifted. John was more determined than ever to set things right, while Charlotte and Harper seemed to be grappling with the reality that their days of total control might be coming to an end. Ava woke up early, but this time not to do her usual chores. John had insisted that she take the day for herself, something she had never done before. Still, out of habit, she went down to the kitchen and found Faith preparing breakfast. "Good morning, Faith," Ava said with a small smile. "Good morning, dear," Faith replied, pausing for a moment to look at her. "Are you all right?" Ava hesitated. The question seemed simple, but the answer was anything but. She shrugged. "I guess so. It's all so new. I don't know what to think." Faith sighed and stepped closer. "You're a strong girl, Ava. You've been through so much. But you know what I think? I think for the first time you have someone who truly cares about you, and that makes all the difference." Ava gave her a shy smile, but there was still uncertainty in her eyes. She knew John was trying, but there were still too many ghosts from her past to face. Meanwhile, upstairs, John sat in his office reviewing documents. He had decided to take the definitive step. He was preparing to divorce Charlotte. He knew the decision would bring more conflict, but he also knew it was best for everyone. He could no longer live in such a toxic environment and was ready to start fresh, even if it meant facing resistance. Charlotte, however, had caught wind of his intentions through her lawyers and was ready to fight. She stormed into the office without knocking, holding a stack of papers. "Is this serious, John?" she demanded, throwing the papers onto his desk. "Are you really going to trade me for that girl?" John looked up, tired but calm. "This isn't about trading anyone, Charlotte. It's about doing what's right. And honestly, we both know this marriage ended a long time ago." Charlotte scoffed, but the anger in her eyes gave way to something closer to frustration. "And what's going to happen to me, to Harper? You think you can just throw all of this away and start over?" "You're not being thrown away, Charlotte," he replied patiently. "Harper will need to grow up, learn to deal with the real world. And you'll have your life just as you've always wanted. I won't leave anyone without support, but I also can't keep pretending we're happy." Charlotte was silent for a moment. For the first time, she seemed to consider his words. But her pride wouldn't let her admit any fault. "Do whatever you want, John, but don't expect me to make it easy for you." "I never expected that from you," he said firmly. As the tension between John and Charlotte mounted, Harper sat in her room reflecting on everything. For the first time, her arrogant facade was cracking. She felt rejected, but she also started to realize that the life she had been leading wasn't sustainable. Later that day, when Ava went to the small garden in the back of the house, she was surprised to see Harper suddenly appear. Ava immediately tensed, expecting another round of taunts, but to her surprise, Harper seemed different. "Can I talk to you?" Harper asked, without her usual sarcastic tone. Ava hesitated but nodded. "Look, I know I've been horrible to you," Harper began, crossing her arms and avoiding eye contact. "But I don't know. I guess I was angry. Angry at my dad, angry at everything. And I took it out on you." Ava stayed silent, trying to make sense of what was happening. "I don't know if I can accept you as my sister," Harper continued honestly, "but I think I can try. Because if there's one thing I've learned these past few days, it's that you're not going anywhere. And if my dad believes in you, maybe I should give you a chance." Ava looked at Harper, and for the first time, saw something beyond the arrogance. There was fragility there, a humanity she hadn't expected. Ava took a deep breath before responding. "I don't want to take anything from you, Harper. I just want a place in the world, like anyone else. And if you're willing to try, so am I." Harper nodded, looking relieved. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was a start. As the sun set, John watched the scene from the window of his office. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of hope. Things were far from perfect, but he knew they had taken an important step. That night, Ava returned to her small room and picked up the photo of her mother. She looked at Susan's smiling face and, for the first time, felt that she had done what her mother would have wanted, found a way forward, even in the midst of chaos. She whispered, "I think I'm in the right place now, Mum." And with that, Ava closed her eyes, feeling for the first time in a long while the promise of a future where she wouldn't have to face everything alone.